Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be following on from yesterday's video, which was a review of The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. Today we're going to be talking about static characters. This is a point I raised in the review very briefly. The idea behind this topic was the character of Philip Marlowe in this book doesn't have what you would describe as a character arc. He is a rough and tumble detective who is jaded with the world from the moment we meet him, and at the end of the book he's a rough and tumble detective who's jaded with the world. And I'm pretty sure, although I haven't read them all, that that's how he stays. He is a static character, and that has a long lineage in fiction that goes through from like the earliest days of fiction right through to today. So let's take a little journey into the idea of the static character. Now, the static character, I believe, would have begun mostly as a result of serialized fiction back in the good old days of when books were not written as books. They were published in little bits and pieces in magazines. Short story collections used to be a much bigger deal. Sort of the earliest origin point I can think of is with the Robert E. Howard character Conan the Barbarian. Conan the Barbarian is a character that you may be familiar with. There's been a few film adaptations. Like Conan is like a classic old school fantasy character, but basically there were like hundreds and dozens and dozens of short stories written about this one character and the various adventures that he went through. None of them, from what I understand, are really like chronologically placed. There's no sense of progression with the character and the story because they are individual stories. The idea was that you could go in at basically any point into one of these magazines, find a Conan story and read it as its self-contained thing, and that's fine. But Conan has no real goals outside of the immediate threats that he faces. So, like, imagine he gets approached by a queen to go and slay a monster in a tower, and the story is about him going to slay the monster in the tower, and at the end he goes off and then he goes and does another adventure the next week. So his character doesn't really change and it doesn't really grow because he doesn't have like a central motivation. He doesn't have something that he's working towards, therefore he will never achieve it. You see what I mean? Like, he doesn't have a goal. When you start with a character in a normal series as we would understand it now, like an A to B series or even just a standalone novel, like, you get a sense very early on what their motivation is for doing the things that happen in the book, like for getting involved in the plot in the first place. So for example, the series of unfortunate events, I only say this because I'm literally using half the series to stack my camera up here. The series of unfortunate events, the motivation throughout the whole book is for them to be rid of Count Olaf. Now, every book they make steps to escape Count Olaf, and by the end they've grown to a point where they can escape Count Olaf. So they grow as characters throughout the series. It's all continuity, it's one story, goes through, and there's an end point which pays off their motivation. With serial fiction, you didn't really get that because the idea was that the different chunks of the story didn't form a cohesive narrative. So Conan the Barbarian isn't the only character to do this. I think one of the more famous examples would be Sherlock Holmes. All of the Sherlock Holmes stories, pretty much for the most part, apart from maybe one or two, not chronological order. You can pick and choose in what order these events happened. Obviously there is an end point to that series because Sherlock Holmes obviously famously dies by getting thrown off a waterfall by Moriarty or something, but obviously then he comes back, so who knows with serial fiction. So Sherlock Holmes is a detective character who he's a super sleuth. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Sherlock Holmes, but his character again doesn't really grow and change throughout the stories. He doesn't ponder his past exploits because to the reader's knowledge, if you're just joining us, they may not have even happened. So you can't really ruminate on the past. He doesn't really have an overriding goal. Like, what would his goal be? He can't stop all crime ever. So, you know, he can't really have a goal that he grows towards. And I think one of the more modern examples, because this sort of thing's really died out now, the more modern example of that sort of thing, especially with serial fiction as concerned, would be comic books. Batman has been the same character since the 60s as he is now, more or less. There's been obviously some changes in direction because different writers have taken over the character, but for the most part it's now established who Batman is and what he does, especially who Superman is and what Superman does. These are characters that everyone now knows, and they're very static throughout their plot arcs of their comic books. They don't change and grow because they are a continuous series that has been running for over 40 years with the same characters. So if you had them changing and growing, they would be a complete mess. They would have to get older, they would have to change, and that's not something that that sort of fiction explores. So how has this changed then? So I said that obviously comic books are the modern example of serialized fiction. So how has this changed? Well, I think the Big Sleep was a big changing point in that. Obviously, you've got... This is a full novel length with a character in it. It's not serial fiction, because there's not going to be dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of stories about this guy. So how this changed was people started using the same sort of things, but there are a series of novels that are all self-contained stories with the same character. I'm looking around now for the other book that I got out to discuss this, but I can't find it, so whatever. So the book I was going to hold up is the Da Vinci Code, because Robert Langdon, I've just spotted it, the book I'm holding up now is the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. Now this is the second book in the Robert Langdon series, but ironically people didn't read really Angels and Demons. Like, this is the book that made it big, so people picked this up, and because Robert Langdon is a character that literally never changes, they didn't feel like they missed anything. There are a couple of references in here to the previous book, but he doesn't change as a character, he doesn't grow. It's a self-contained mystery story, and as you can see, the book's huge. Other characters that are like this tend to be in the thriller genre, because you can really do a self-contained mystery with the kind of guy that would go and investigate mysteries again. That's not something that happens in other books. Like, if you had a contemporary story, for example, and the book was about a boy and a girl falling in love, because that's what most contemporaries are about, you can't have them falling in love and then have the next book be them being the same people and falling in love again, if you see what I mean. It's a bit ridiculous. So really, thrillers are the only genre that I can think of where this sort of thing still happens with a static main character. Other famous examples, obviously James Bond is one of the big ones. Like, even in films, James Bond is one of those characters that is like an iconic idea. There's no, like, you can change the actor. Like, that's one of the things that happens in Bond. Like, you change the actor, but there's no sense of continuity of what happened in the past has happened to this guy. Like, you change the actor and it's basically changing the whole character. I think with Bond especially, you do, in the films you have the eras, like the Daniel Craig era, for example, like the events from one will have an impact on the other, sort of, but still Bond doesn't really change in amongst it all. The things around him might change, but he doesn't change. He is just James Bond. He does the thing that James Bond does. And when Daniel Craig is gone, I'm pretty sure all of that history will be erased, and a new continuity will be established. Jason Bourne is like another one. Obviously, Robert Ludlum wrote a few novels in the Bourne saga, but they didn't really take off, unfortunately. I think, is Robert Ludlum dead? Is he one of the ones that's dead and it's a different guy taking over? I know Stieg Larsson's one of those. with the Millennium Trilogy. Jack Reacher is like probably the biggest one now. Dan Brown, like the Da Vinci Code stuff, I think is all like fallen apart. I don't think people don't take his books that seriously. But Jack Reacher is one of those that have flown sort of under the radar. Very long running series, lots of books in it. Jack Reacher goes in, he's an ex-military policeman, he solves the crime, and he goes off. Like, he's like the iconic, he's probably the most iconic example of this now, because he literally is just a drifter that goes around and solves crimes. So he's like one of those people. Back in the old days, of course, along with your people like Philip Marlowe, you've got your cozy mysteries, Agatha Christie, like big examples, Poirot, you know, Miss Marple, all those sorts of characters. They're static characters that, like, they have immediate goals but don't grow as characters. Now, what I really need to discuss now that I've talked about the history of it all is, do I think this is a bad thing or not? And I don't know. Like, it's not something that I'm drawn to, really, because I really like getting a sense of growth with characters. I like characters to have an arc, not only throughout a series but throughout a particular story. I like to see the way that events change them as people and get them thinking, because that sort of thing makes me think as well. Like, if you're following a character, you're supposed to essentially identify with them in some way, and that means if you're sort of following them and you're going along with their worldview, it's more interesting as a reader to have that viewpoint from the character's point of view challenged, and therefore it challenges your thoughts as the reader. If you have a static character, you root for the hero, he does the thing, and you don't mind, you know, you never change your mind, you don't really think about anything. And I think that does create sort of mindless fiction in a way, and that is what pulp fiction like is about. It's not just the name of a Quentin Tarantino film. Pulp fiction was this disposable literature for the masses to consume, and to do that effectively you have to churn them out, and to churn them out you have to have a static character. So do I think it's a bad thing? No, I don't think it's a really great thing, but I think it's a necessary thing. I don't think it's bad. I think it's absolutely fine to have these sort of static characters that you can go in for a comfy read. Maybe these sorts of books are like the only books that people read like throughout the whole year. Like, people look forward year to year. Oh yes, the new Jack Reacher's coming out, I'll be reading that, and then nothing else. And that's fine. You know, it's different strokes for different folks. I think character development is a big thing that I look for in books, and that's why I'm not so drawn to it. But I can definitely see the appeal, and I understand why it happens. So the other thing that obviously these characters are tied to is the idea of an infinite series. Jack Reacher, as I said, is a huge long series now. The Da Vinci Code, like, is part of the Robert Langdon series. There's plenty of books in that now. Philip Marlowe, I'm sure there's plenty of Philip Marlowe mysteries. Agatha Christie's written dozens and dozens of books. So what I want to ask in this discussion is two things. One, do you enjoy static characters? Do you see the value in them? Do you think they're a good thing, or do you think they're a negative thing? Definitely share your opinion on that. The other thing I want to know is, can you do an infinite series without a static character? I am on the fence as to whether or not you can do it effectively, unless your series is more like a shared world. Terry Pratchett did the Discworld series, which is essentially a continuous series. It could be an infinite series, but it doesn't have a static character, because it follows different characters the whole time. Like, you'll have a block of books that follow a certain character, and then a block of books that follow a different one, but they're all part of the same series because they're all part of the Discworld. So that's possibly the only way you can do it, is if you have like a shared universe. But I think for a long running series, having a static character that you can use as the anchor point is very important. And I'm not 100% convinced that you can effectively do this sort of infinite series without a static character. So let me know what you think. Comment below, or better yet, make a response video. I'm absolutely happy for you to share links to your videos if you do one in the comments section. Even if they get flagged as spam, if I see that it's a valuable response, I will obviously approve it. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Hope it gets you thinking, and I will see you next time.